The letter arrived on an ordinary morning, buried between utility bills and advertisements, looking no different from the rest of the mail. It carried the seal of a law firm I had never heard of, and for a brief moment, I considered setting it aside. At that point in my life, nothing good ever came from official envelopes. Bills meant stress. Legal notices meant trouble. I opened it anyway, without much thought, not realizing it would completely change the direction of my life. The letter informed me that my grandfather, a man I barely knew and had not seen in over a decade, had passed away. That part didn't surprise me. He had lived quietly, far from the rest of the family, and contact had faded long ago. What did surprise me was the next line. According to the document, I was the sole heir to his property. Not a small inheritance, not a sentimental keepsake, but land. A large amount of land. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe an old cabin, a few acres in the mountains, something rustic and half-forgotten. The letter mentioned a mountain property, which only reinforced that assumption. I imagined a rundown structure with a leaky roof, surrounded by trees, worth little more than its memories. I nearly laughed at the idea of hiring a lawyer over something like that. But then I read the acreage. 1,300 acres. I read the number again, slowly, convinced I had misunderstood. 1,300 acres wasn't a cabin. It wasn't even a farm. It was a massive stretch of land, the kind that didn't just sit quietly in the background. It demanded attention. Questions. Explanations. The letter instructed me to contact the firm to finalize the transfer. Still skeptical, I made the call. The lawyer confirmed everything in a calm, professional tone, as if this kind of inheritance happened every day. The land had been in my grandfather's name for decades. The paperwork was solid. Taxes had been paid regularly. There were no competing heirs. As far as the law was concerned, the land was mine. I didn't feel excited. I felt confused. My grandfather had never mentioned owning anything like that. No one in the family had. And yet, there it was, sitting quietly on paper, waiting for me. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched the address online, expecting to find wilderness, maybe a few satellite images of trees and dirt roads. What came up instead made my stomach tighten. The map showed development. Roads. Perfectly aligned houses. Cul-de-sacs. A sprawling residential area with neat lawns and identical rooftops. The name of the neighborhood was clearly labeled, along with a familiar term I had only ever heard in complaint stories online. HOA. At first, I thought the map must be outdated or incorrect. There was no way an entire homeowners association could exist on land my grandfather owned, without anyone in the family knowing. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. Hundreds of homes sat neatly inside the boundaries of the property listed under my inheritance. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the land had been sold off in pieces years ago and the paperwork was incomplete. Maybe my grandfather had retained mineral rights or some small section, and the acreage number was misleading. I needed facts, not speculation. So I did what anyone would do. I drove out to see it for myself. The trip took hours, leading me through winding mountain roads before opening into a wide valley. The sight that greeted me was nothing like the lonely cabin I had imagined. Instead, there was a polished entrance sign, landscaped with stone and flowers, proudly displaying the name of the community. Security cameras sat on tall poles. A gate stood open, as if welcoming residents home. I parked nearby and stepped out of the car, suddenly feeling out of place. Everything about the neighborhood screamed order and control. The houses were expensive, uniform, and clearly governed by strict rules. This was not accidental development. This was intentional, organized, and well-funded. As I walked deeper into the community, the scale of it became overwhelming. Streets stretched far into the distance. Luxury homes lined both sides, each one sitting comfortably on land that, according to legal documents, belonged to me. I felt like a stranger walking through someone else's life, even though the ground beneath my feet said otherwise. I noticed plaques, notices, and signs referencing the HOA. Rules about parking. Landscaping guidelines. Quiet hours. Fines for non-compliance. This wasn't a small association struggling to manage a few homes. This was a powerful organization, confident in its authority. That confidence puzzled me. If the land truly belonged to my grandfather, how had this happened? How could hundreds of homes be built without ownership changing hands? There were only two possibilities. Either my inheritance was wrong, or something deeply questionable had taken place. I returned home and began digging into public records. Deeds. Surveys. Old contracts. The deeper I went, the more disturbing the picture became. My grandfather had purchased the land in the early 1950s, long before any development existed. He had never sold it. There were no records of transfer, no subdivision approvals tied to his name. Yet decades later, construction permits appeared. Infrastructure approvals. HOA formation documents. All of them referenced the land as if ownership were a minor detail, something assumed rather than proven. It was as if the development had simply appeared on top of the property, layer by layer, without anyone questioning who truly owned the ground beneath it. The realization hit me slowly and then all at once. An entire HOA had been built on my grandfather's land. Not leased. Not legally purchased. Built. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't a simple paperwork error. It was a long-standing assumption, possibly even an intentional oversight, that had gone unchallenged for decades. My grandfather had lived quietly, paid his taxes, and never visited the land. Meanwhile, others had moved in, profited, and enforced rules as if ownership were unquestionable. By the end of the week, I knew one thing for certain. This inheritance was not a gift. It was a ticking time bomb. And sooner or later, someone from that HOA was going to notice that the name on the land didn't match the authority they believed they had. That moment came sooner than I expected. The first sign that my quiet investigation was no longer quiet came in the form of a letter taped to my front door. It wasn't mailed. It wasn't sealed. It was placed there deliberately, as if someone wanted to make sure it felt personal. The paper carried the logo of the homeowners association I had seen throughout the neighborhood, bold and confident, the kind of branding meant to project authority. The notice claimed I had violated HOA rules by loitering within the community without authorization. It cited surveillance footage, referenced bylaws, and warned of escalating penalties if the behavior continued. What stood out most was the tone. It didn't ask who I was or why I had been there. It assumed I was just another problem to be corrected. That assumption told me everything I needed to know about how the HOA viewed the land. I contacted the association using the number listed on the notice, expecting confusion, or at least hesitation. Instead, I was met with absolute certainty. According to their records, the entire development sat on land fully controlled by the HOA, governed by its board, and protected by decades of uninterrupted use. Any claim otherwise, they implied, was misguided. What they didn't know was that I had already confirmed the land records at the county office. Over the next few days, I gathered everything. Certified copies of deeds. Tax payment histories. Original surveys dating back to the 1950s. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. Ownership had never transferred. The land beneath that HOA had always belonged to my grandfather and, now, to me. Armed with this information, I requested a formal meeting. The HOA board agreed, though not without resistance. They scheduled it quickly, almost too quickly, as if they wanted to shut the situation down before it grew. When I arrived, the room was filled with framed photos of community events and awards for excellence in neighborhood management. Everything about the setting reinforced the Their belief that they were the rightful authority. I laid out the facts calmly and methodically. I presented the documents, explained the chain of ownership, and outlined the absence of any legal sale or lease agreement. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I simply stated the truth as supported by public records. The reaction was not what I expected. Instead of concern, there was dismissal. Instead of questions, there were deflections. The board members leaned back in their chairs, confident that history and size were on their side. They spoke about adverse possession, long-term use, and assumed rights, throwing around legal terms without offering proof. To them, decades of occupation outweighed paperwork from a man who never lived there. That was when the tone changed. They informed me that any attempt to interfere with the HOA's operations would be considered harassment. They suggested that challenging the community's status could negatively impact property values, a phrase that carried more weight than any direct threat. It was clear they expected me to back down, overwhelmed by the scale of what I was facing. But backing down wasn't an option anymore. I left the meeting with a strange sense of clarity. The HOA wasn't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were relying on the assumption that no one would ever challenge them. That the original owner was gone. That heirs wouldn't bother. That money and numbers would always win. They had built an entire system on that assumption. In the weeks that followed, I escalated quietly. I hired a property attorney who specialized in land disputes and development law. He didn't react with shock when I showed him the documents. Instead, he smiled in a way that told me he had already spotted the cracks. According to him, the HOA's position was weak. Very weak. There was no record of eminent domain. No condemnation proceedings. No purchase agreements. The permits issued decades earlier had been approved based on faulty or incomplete ownership verification. In simpler terms, the county had allowed development without confirming who actually owned the land. That oversight didn't erase ownership. It just delayed the consequences. The attorney advised patience. Any aggressive move would trigger panic and resistance. Instead, we needed leverage. Something undeniable. Something that forced the HOA to acknowledge reality. That leverage came in the form of land use rights. While the HOA controlled the houses and the community rules, they did not control the ground beneath them. That meant access roads, utility easements, and common areas were legally sitting on my property. Every driveway, every shared park, every private road existed because my grandfather had allowed the land to remain untouched, not because he had given permission. With that understanding, we sent a formal notice. The letter was simple and devastating. It stated that the HOA was occupying privately owned land without a valid lease or purchase agreement. It demanded immediate negotiations to establish lawful use. Until then, the HOA's presence was unauthorized. The reaction was immediate. Residents began asking questions. HOA meetings grew tense. Rumors spread through the community, half understood and heavily filtered by the board. Some homeowners dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Others worried quietly, sensing that something was deeply wrong. The HOA board, however, shifted into full defense mode. They issued statements reassuring residents that everything was under control. They claimed ownership disputes were administrative issues that would be resolved quickly. But behind closed doors, their confidence was cracking. They knew what I knew now. Paperwork mattered, and they didn't have it. Then came their counter-move. The HOA attempted to fine me. They issued penalties for interference, misrepresentation, and disruption of community harmony. The irony was almost impressive. An organization living on land it didn't own was trying to punish the actual owner for asking questions. We ignored the fines and responded with another legal notice, this one far more direct. It outlined potential claims for back rent, unauthorized use, and unjust enrichment. Decades of occupancy, calculated at even a modest rate, amounted to an unthinkable sum. That was the moment everything changed. The HOA could no longer pretend I was a nuisance. I was a liability. A massive one. Requests for meetings poured in. Lawyers appeared. The tone shifted from dismissive to cautious, then to strained politeness. They wanted to negotiate, but they also wanted control. They wanted to minimize damage without admitting fault. What they didn't realize was that control had already slipped away. By the end of the month, the truth was undeniable. The HOA's entire existence rested on land they did not legally own. Every day they delayed resolution increased their exposure. And for the first time since the development was built, the balance of power had flipped. They had governed unquestioned for decades. Now, they were standing on borrowed ground. By the time the HOA formally acknowledged my claim, the damage had already been done. The illusion of absolute control they had carefully maintained for decades was gone, replaced by uncertainty that seeped into every corner of the community. Meetings grew longer and more frequent. Attendance swelled with anxious homeowners who wanted answers that the board could no longer provide with confidence. The neighborhood that once prided itself on order now felt fragile, balanced on a truth it had avoided for far too long. Behind the scenes, the HOA's legal team worked urgently, searching for any overlooked document, any forgotten agreement that could legitimize their position. Nothing surfaced. Every path they explored led back to the same dead end: the land had never been sold. It had never been leased. The foundation of their authority existed only because no one had questioned it before. At the same time, my legal team moved carefully and deliberately. There was no rush to force an immediate confrontation. Pressure came from clarity, not chaos. We compiled a full accounting of land use, identifying roads, green spaces, drainage systems, and utility corridors that crossed my property. Each item was documented, mapped, and valued. The picture that emerged was impossible to ignore. The HOA wasn't just occupying land, it depended on it entirely. That dependency shifted everything. When negotiations finally began, the tone was cautious and restrained. The HOA no longer spoke as an unquestioned ruler of the community. It spoke as an organization facing exposure. They proposed settlements that avoided acknowledging fault, suggesting symbolic payments or partial adjustments that would allow them to continue operating as before. Each proposal underestimated the reality of their position. Ownership was not symbolic. It was absolute. The legal framework was clear. Without a valid agreement, every square foot they occupied constituted unauthorized use. Years of collected dues, property appreciation, and community expansion had all been built on land they did not own. The longer the negotiations dragged on, the more leverage shifted in my favor. Residents began to understand what was happening. Some felt betrayed by the HOA leadership for failing to disclose the risk sooner. Others felt uneasy knowing their homes rested on land tied up in a dispute they never consented to. A few attempted to downplay the situation, convinced it would resolve quietly. But most recognized that something fundamental had changed. The HOA's power no longer came from rules or fines. It came from my willingness to let them stay. Eventually, the board faced an unavoidable truth. The community needed a legitimate agreement to survive. Without one, everything from road access to utility maintenance stood on unstable ground. Lawsuits from residents were becoming a real possibility, and lenders were beginning to ask questions. The situation could no longer be contained. That was when the HOA made its final move. They requested a comprehensive land use agreement, one that would retroactively legitimize their presence and allow them to continue operating. In return, they offered compensation. The initial offer was substantial by ordinary standards, but it barely acknowledged the scale of what had occurred. It treated decades of unauthorized use as an inconvenience rather than a foundational failure. The response was simple and final. Any agreement would reflect the true value of the land and the years it had been used. There would be no shortcuts, no quiet erasure of the past. If the HOA wanted certainty, it would come at a cost equal to the risk they had ignored for generations. Negotiations stretched on, but the outcome was inevitable. The HOA had no viable alternative. Relocating an entire community was impossible. Fighting in court would expose records they desperately wanted buried. Delays only increased financial and legal pressure. In the end, they agreed. The final arrangement granted the HOA continued use of the land under a long-term, legally binding lease. The terms were strict, transparent, and enforceable. Rent was calculated based on market value, adjusted for the scale of development and the years of prior use. Oversight provisions ensured that no future assumptions could replace documented agreements again. For the HOA, it was a humbling reckoning. For me, it was closure. The community didn't collapse. Homes didn't vanish. Life continued much as it had before, but with one crucial difference. Authority was no longer assumed. It was defined. The HOA still managed rules and maintenance, but it did so with the understanding that its foundation rested on someone else's land and someone else's permission. Over time, tensions eased. Residents adjusted to the new reality. Some even expressed relief, knowing that the uncertainty had been resolved through clear ownership rather than ignored indefinitely. The neighborhood regained its sense of stability, this time grounded in legality rather than convenience. As for me, the inheritance that once felt like an unwanted complication became something else entirely. Not a windfall, not a victory, but a reminder of how easily power can drift when no one pays attention. My grandfather's land had been overlooked, assumed forgotten, quietly absorbed into someone else's plans. All it took was one letter to bring it back into focus. The HOA had spent decades enforcing rules on land it did not own. In the end, it wasn't anger or revenge that changed everything. It was paperwork, patience, and the simple truth of ownership. They had built an entire system on borrowed ground. And now, finally, they understood what that truly meant.